Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about public condolences. Specifically, I would like to talk to you about the infamous phrase, thoughts and prayers, which, if you recall, a year or two ago, we were all shamed out of using because it offended people. Ostentatiously, we were told that the reason that it offended people was because people who would say thoughts and prayers were doing so instead of actually helping. They weren't doing anything to offer real material aid. They were simply saying, my thoughts and prayers are with you, as a way of avoiding any sort of responsibility. And that has proven to be a lie. Because in the wake of both the Henry Novak slaying and the events that occurred in Belfast, where a man is almost beheaded by an African who came to the UK under the guise of refuge, we hear many people in the media and in Parliament, including Keir Starmer, the first openly atheist Prime Minister of the UK, saying, my thoughts are with him. My thoughts are with the victims and their families. And that's an interesting turn of phrase. One, I believe it was Lammy, but I'm not going to say for certain. I don't have the internet to check to make certain. But I did hear one person say, my thoughts and sympathies are with them. Not a one of them said, my thoughts and prayers are with the families and the victims of this time. Not a one. They obeyed the rules. They knew that saying my thoughts and prayers are with them is offensive and shouldn't do that anymore. But they did say my thoughts are with them. And one even said my thoughts and sympathies are with them. And there was no media outrage at the Shallow Platitude and how it's being substituted for real work. Indeed, not a word about how offensive this is, or how offering shallow platitudes instead of actual help is not going to work. Not a one. No one complains. No one in the media erupted in anger at Keir Starmer and others saying, my thoughts are with the victims and the families. No one complained about that person who said, my thoughts and sympathies are with the family. But I bet if someone had slipped up and said, my thoughts and prayers are with them, we would hear how awful that was. Because ultimately, the establishment is anti-Christian. Even in the UK, which still has an established church, they hate having an established church, and they use their power to make certain bishops in the established church are as left-wing as possible. But they would prefer to disestablish the church, just as they would prefer to abolish the monarchy and have a republic, having the United Republics of Great Britain instead of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And a lot of conservatives in America don't understand that. They actually think that it's time to get rid of the monarchy, and they think about how awful the current government in the UK is, and they honestly think abolishing the monarchy gets rid of what the progressives want, when it's exactly what the progressives want, and it would make Britain even more left-wing, but I digress. Our establishment can't simply abolish the monarchy and all Christian traditions overnight, though they are constitutional, and it takes more of a mandate to do so. Nevertheless, they hate Christians. They hate Christianity. And they hate God. So they're like modern atheists who claim to merely lack belief in a God, but they really don't lack belief. They assert as a fact that God does not exist. And they insist that we approach the entire world from a materialist, secular humanist way, without offering any justification for that other than religion is dangerous, primitive, and superstitious. We won't be religious, we will be secular. Now, keep in mind, my actual view is that secularism is a form of religion in its own right. But they insist on seeing secularism as the opposite of religion, and religion is both outdated and dangerous and wrong. It is morally wrong to be religious. And they equate being religious with believing in a God. And they want that. And they have this idea of the march of history leading to progress. That's why they think that we once lived in a time of oppression that evolved into monarchy. Monarchy became outdated and we evolved past it into a democratic state. And they believe that during the evolutionary stages of man, we've evolved past the need for religion. It's primitive and it holds us back and it's against science. And we are becoming a more rational, enlightened species. So we shall be a less religious and more secular species until finally religion dies and reason prevails. And they want to hasten that along because they're still operating under the idea that liberal secular humanism is a higher, more advanced state. And that is what they're actively promoting. And not just in Westminster. They're promoting this globally. They want that vision of a Star Trek future where everyone is secular and socialist and everyone gets along and it's a utopia. They won't get it, of course, because the liberal secular values don't actually work, but they won't admit that because, again, as much as they see themselves as non-religious, they actually hold a religious commitment to materialism, to naturalism, and to atheism, and to the humanist ethos, to humanist values. And therein lies the point. These people were never upset by people saying my thoughts and prayers are with you, because the people saying it were doing so as a shallow platitude and a substitute for actual material aid. They were doing so because they object to prayer. And they don't want to openly admit that. Partly because they don't want to anger the Muslims who also pray, but also in part because their movement operates through subterfuge and because, whether they want to admit it or not, there has been a renewed interest in prayer. And they don't want to just openly admit that they're engaged in social engineering that may give the game away. So they'll oppose something that calls our minds to God. But they won't admit that the reason they're opposing it is because it calls our minds to God. And you'll see this a lot with progressives. And let's face it, the skeptic community is just progressives. The new atheism mainly existed to promote progressivism. It wasn't a group of people who had nothing in common but a lack of belief in a God. It was people who asserted as a fact that God didn't exist and we live in a material universe and that we should embrace secular humanism, which is a progressive religion that pretends to be a non-religious life stance. And that's the entire goal. It operates through subterfuge. But really, they're hoping to control the language we use and the perceptions we have, so that our behavior and our thoughts reflect secular humanist values, in the hopes that if we all talk like secular humanists and never reference God, and if we all behave as secular humanists, we will eventually become secular humanists, and it will be alien and foreign to us to even think about praying, that we won't even think about God. We will look at everything as it is, a materialist way of doing things, because there is no supernatural powers. There's only the material, there's only the natural, and as rational people, we will only look at the real world, the material, natural world, and we won't even think about anything religious. That's the thinking they're going with. They're hoping to control our language and the way we grieve, the way we mourn, the way we celebrate, the way we do everything. And that's one reason they are very obsessed with policing the words we use. And they have succeeded in many ways. We no longer talk about lovers, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends. We now talk about our partners. and it's very unisex and uniform and rather dull when you think about it. I know a lot of people go along with it, but have you ever thought about what it means to call someone your partner? And I don't mean just in business. I'm writing a story right now where characters refer to each other as partners, but that's because they work together. But it's something that today we use for our significant other. And I will say something like, my partner and I bought a house. My partner and I moved in. My partner and I are thinking about having a child. And that's rather flattening. But the reason they want you to say partner instead of husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend is because they want everything flat and level and equal, and they don't want one type of relationship to seem more than another. And it's a way of approaching it as much more utilitarian. And people have embraced it. People have gone along with it. And you see this with other things. We no longer talk about, well, we can't on this platform, but we no longer talk about when people unalive themselves. We don't say they commit slurry slide. We say they died by slurry slide, as if slurry slide is some external force that acts upon them. And this goes along with the humanist ethos. Because humanists, in spite of claiming otherwise, I have noticed they don't like taking responsibility for their own actions. So instead of saying that someone, and they don't like being reminded that taking responsibility for one's actions is something that people do. So they want to create a culture that views one's events in life as some external thing that happens to you and that you experience. They reduce the meaning of life to gaining these experiences. But they don't really want people to actually have a proactive view of it, especially since most of them wish us to believe in biological and physical determinism, because materialism is true, God doesn't exist, there's nothing supernatural, and everything is just matter in motion. So they will teach that because our consciousness emerged from matter and emerges from the brain and its synapses and all these physical processes, that every thought you had is preceded by other previous thoughts and conditions in your brain. So it's operating in a determinist fashion, and that everything that's happening around us was predetermined by the conditions of the creation of the universe. Conditions which, of course, were themselves purely natural. And that means that there is no such thing as free will. And in order to reinforce the idea that there's no free will, they have this idea that things occur to you. Even taking one's own life is something that happens externally to the person's own will, because one does not have a will. It is something that occurs to them. And therein is exactly the point that is being made here. They have successfully conditioned us to speak in a certain way that causes us to intuitively think a certain way. And it makes it very difficult to question their narrative, which they don't allow you to question anyway. When you bring up objections to materialism or to atheism, they'll ridicule you for being primitive and superstitious and obviously wrong, without, of course, ever having to prove you're wrong, because they merely lack belief in the supernatural and lack belief in a God, and therefore they're not making any claims when they call you a delusional idiot. But therein lies the point. They are actively offended by belief in God, because it is primitive, it belongs to the earlier age, it's like monarchy, it's obsolete, we've evolved past it, and our modern democratic age should be more rational and advanced by now. It should be more scientific and not religious, because they operate under the myth that science and religion are opposites, and they believe in science and scientific central planning. And that's why they don't want you to say our thoughts and prayers are with you, because if you say our thoughts and prayers are with you, you are invoking God, because who else do you pray to? While it is, of course, possible to pray to things other than God, it is natural for us to think that if you're praying, it is to God. You are certainly praying to something supernatural, something beyond humanity. They don't like that. They want us to be materialists. And that is why they were offended by saying our thoughts and prayers are with you. And even back when the controversy was going on, you knew that it wasn't really true, that they were offended by people saying my thoughts and prayers are with you, because they were offering a cheap platitude instead of real action, because they would also make fun of prayer. And it wasn't just the usual circles of militant atheists. We even had the governor of Minnesota and the mayor of certain towns in Minnesota after a shooting, mocking the idea of prayer. As if the people saying my thoughts and prayers are with you are saying, if you pray, there'll be a magical force field that prevents violence. And they would even point out when a Christian school was targeted, those children were praying. Their prayers didn't do anything. It didn't stop the killer from killing them. As if people saying my thoughts and prayers are with you is intended to convey the idea that you can erect a magical force field if you pray and nothing bad will happen to you. And that was never the point. When people say my thoughts and prayers are with you, they're offering a condolence. They aren't saying that if we pray, then bad things like this won't happen again, because our prayers will protect us. They will stop bad people from doing bad things to us. So the idea was that Christian schools were attacked. Christian schools pray. If prayer worked, these bad people would not have been able to do this harm, because prayer would have protected them, and it didn't. So stop saying thoughts and prayers. Prayers don't work. It was always a fundamental misunderstanding of what it was, but they successfully saturated the media, so now we're ashamed to say our thoughts and prayers are with you. It's that shallow platitude people say when they're not willing to act, but we are perfectly willing to say, my thoughts are with their family. My thoughts are with the victim at this time. Thoughts and prayers were not offensive. If they were, then saying my thoughts are with you would be just as offensive. If they were offended by people saying my thoughts and prayers are with you, because the people saying that were offering a shallow platitude in place of real action, then they would be just as angry as someone saying my thoughts are with you, because they're doing even less than the people who are offering thoughts and prayers. The people who are offering thoughts and prayers are at least offering thoughts and prayers. The people who say my thoughts are with you are offering only thoughts. And yet offering only thoughts, which is less than thoughts and prayers, does not offend them. Offering only thoughts is considered perfectly reasonable. And wouldn't saying my thoughts are with the victim sound just as much a platitude that people offer when they don't offer real action as thoughts and prayers would? Of course it does. Following their logic, it's just as bad to say my thoughts are with you as to say my thoughts and prayers are with you, if their logic was what really motivated them. And of course, it's not. What really motivates them is a desire to get us to stop praying and to stop believing in God. And that's all it's amounted to. And their anger at saying my thoughts and prayers are with you was entirely designed for that end. Because they want us to be secular humanists. They want us to be materialists. They want us to be atheists. And they can't offer evidence that atheism is true because it really isn't. They can't offer evidence that materialism is true because it really isn't. So they claim that atheism is a mere lack of belief and that materialism is self-evident, and what else could be true? If materialism isn't true, how come we don't have evidence of other things? Materialism is obviously true. And they don't really listen when you explain why this isn't true. You can give evidence for the existence of God. All of the arguments they claim to have debunked for the existence of God rest on evidence, and incidentally haven't been debunked, because when you see popular atheist debunkings of the arguments, it shows that they fundamentally misunderstand what the arguments are. For example, Thomas Aquinas has 5 ways to know God. they treat all of this as 5 separate arguments rather than one large compound argument. And worse, they act as if Aquinas only made 3 arguments. And that's because even though Aquinas presents, in their view, 5 arguments for the existence of God, the first 3 of the 5 arguments are really the same argument being restated. This is them following Richard Dawkins and what Dawkins said in The God Delusion. It's not really true, of course. All 5 of Aquinas' ways are different, but Dawkins didn't understand the arguments and thought the first 3 were the same. And if, of course, the first 3 are the same, you could safely merge them into one argument, and that would mean that you are left with 3 arguments. And of course, he then dispatches them with his logic and reason, the facts and logic of atheism. But he didn't understand any of the real points behind the arguments. And you'll see this today when atheists lazily bring up things like the multiverse to debunk the first cause argument. It's nonsense, and I can't go into detail because it would be too distracting from the real point that I'm making. I have spoken on this in the past, and I will in the future. But for now, if someone were to bring up the first cause argument, they know how to debunk it by bringing up the multiverse, and maybe we live in a multiverse of many universes. And they don't seem to understand that this can't debunk the first cause argument. To debunk an argument means to prove that it's wrong. And even if we were to accept that if we live in a multiverse of many universes, then the first cause argument is not true. They can't prove that we live in a multiverse of many universes. They're just asserting that we might live in a multiverse of many universes, and then smuggling in the assumption that we do as if it is a fact, and then using that to say they debunked the argument, when in reality all they're doing is presenting an alternative explanation. And you can't really prove that explanation 1 is false just because you offer explanation 2. You may have challenged explanation 1 successfully, but you have not proven explanation 1 is false. And why should we believe in the multiverse instead of the God did it argument, other than the fact that atheists make fun of God did it? They don't give a reason to that. It's just that the multiverse of many universes sounds more scientific to them, and therefore we should believe it instead. And that's about the size of their argument. They don't really seem to give an actual reason. And of course, the multiverse theory doesn't work anyway, since even if we live in a multiverse of many universes, that wouldn't preclude God creating the multiverse. The first cause argument does not argue that God created this universe and this universe alone, and doesn't depend on there being only one universe. It talks about God as ground of being, which means that everything else flows from God. Not just everything else in this universe, but everything at all that exists flows from God. They also don't seem to understand the many worlds interpretation in actual physics. The idea that we have other universes, plural, is grammatically incorrect. The term universe literally means one truth. There can be only one universe. But saying that doesn't really preclude the idea of a multiverse of many universes. It just means that we are using the wrong words. We shouldn't call them other universes. But really, the multi-worlds theory is treated by modern atheists as if it's just a bigger thing that makes the universe bigger. Like, we used to think the whole universe was our solar system, and then we found out about galaxies, and then we found out there's more than one galaxy. Well, now we found out there's more than one universe, with each universe having multiple galaxies, and galaxies having multiple solar systems. So we have a multiverse with many universes sliding around. And that's why you'll hear them come up with silly things, like maybe our universe was actually created by 2 universes colliding together. You can't really have that, though, in the real many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, because the reason that it is speculated that we have many worlds is a way of solving the problem of superposition, where a particle actually exists in every possible state until the particle is observed, and then the wave function collapses into a singular route. The question that is posed in quantum mechanics is, if a particle requires an observer to collapse into a single field, then why is it that particles began to collapse into fields in the first place? It would naturally lead one to assume that there is an observer collapsing the fields. And we don't like that because we are devoted materialists. We don't even like quantum mechanics. That's why we've segregated it into its own world, the quantum world, which is filled with quantum weirdness, as opposed to the real world of classical material physics. And we try and connect these two because we know one comes from the other. We come up with things like string theory. But we really don't like thinking about the implications of quantum mechanics, which ultimately destroys materialism. Because we are not made of matter. We're made of energy fields that coalesce into the forms that we see in matter, but are ultimately not solid matter, not at root. And it becomes even more absurd to think about things in terms of materialist determinism when you realize that existence is actually probabilistic rather than absolute. And the very fact that an observer has to exist to observe the particle to cause a wave function to collapse means that there has to be some form of mechanism that observes reality. And modern physics, largely driven by atheistic assumptions, because in the 19th century, atheists and materialists largely captured the institutions and promoted the idea that science and religion are at odds, and we have a culture now that makes it very hostile for people who, as we call them, are religious, to become scientists. Not because their religious beliefs conflict with actual science, but because the culture around science is highly atheistic. And yet at the same time, we know that the materialist assumptions driving modern science, as well as that drive modern cultural perceptions and modern social theories, are wrong. And we know they're wrong because quantum mechanics does not allow for them. That's why we have to come up with this bridge between the real world of classical physics and the world of quantum weirdness. It's not really weird. It's just something that they don't like. It really aligns quite well with Aristotelian logic and scholasticism, but we're not bringing those back because those are primitive religious ideas, and we want to be materialists because that's the way to be rational, even if it means ignoring the evidence. Because to us, being rational means being a materialist who holds to humanist views. But at any rate, the many worlds interpretation exists precisely because if the particles never truly collapse into one path, if instead particles take every path, then when all is said and done, the reason we see a particle collapse when we observe it is simply because that's the line we are on. It isn't because we as observers are causing the collapse. Rather, there are many possible timelines, and everything that could have possibly existed does exist. Everything that could have possibly happened did happen. So every possible historical timeline from the beginning of time onward did occur. It just occurred in an alternate timeline, in an alternate universe, as we say now. But the many worlds theory doesn't actually postulate that we live in something large called a multiverse with many universes in it as discrete units in the same way galaxies are. Rather, it postulates that every particle that exists took every possible route, and we are only capable of seeing and perceiving and interacting in the one that we are in. And this gets rid of the need for an observer to collapse wave function. What actually happens, according to the multiple worlds theory, is not that an observer causes the wave function to collapse, but rather the wave function always collapses in every direction, and we just happen to be in the universe when it collapses this way. That's the origin of the many worlds theory and the interpretation. It is a way of trying to preserve certain materialist assumptions, including the assumption that consciousness emerges from matter, because we are all just matter in motion, and we started out as inert matter that eventually somehow combined to create life, and via the processes of evolution, life developed until it began to become aware, and consciousness emerges from matter, that at a certain point in history there was no consciousness, and that consciousness is a product of material reality. The implications of quantum mechanics, of course, is that this isn't so, and that consciousness is embedded in reality, and that while conscious beings may evolve to an extent, this is not consciousness coming into existence via material means, but rather consciousness expressing itself in matter. And there's a very large discrepancy between that. There's a very large difference between consciousness not existing until matter is arranged in a certain way for it to emerge, and consciousness being embedded in the nature of reality itself and expressing itself through a material reality that is largely illusory. And they don't want us thinking that way, so they just say, shut up and do the maths when it comes to quantum mechanics, and they come up with fanciful things like string theory and the many worlds interpretation in order to salvage a materialism that is already dead, because we are not solid material beings. And the world does function more like a Thomistic or an Aristotelian model, and we don't want to admit that. And that is why we don't want to say our thoughts and prayers are with you, because it calls to something higher. The first and primary observer, the one that started the wave function collapse in the first place. God, a universal consciousness. And of course now I'm certain if an atheist hears this, they'll say, which God? And they'll get after me for assuming it's my God, the Christian God Yahweh, and they'll bring up the idea of other religions, and they'll ask me, how do you know it's not the Muslim God Allah? How do you know it's the Christian God Yahweh? You're just making an assumption. It's unwarranted. And to them, I would like to point out the idea that every religion worships a different God carries with it the assumption that every religion worships a God that is invented and exists purely in the imagination, so that the way the God in that religion is described is entirely accurate, because that God is just a fictional character, and the properties that that God has, the characteristics that define that God, are purely imaginary and contained within that religion, and thus entirely accurate, because the religion made him up. That means that the Muslim God named Allah is a different God than the Christian God named Yahweh, because the Christian God has a son and the Muslim God doesn't, and a few other differences. But we don't really approach other topics that way, with the automatic assumption that it's fiction, and therefore every description is accurate to itself. And this assumption is just smuggled into the modern arguments, and to be fair, it's one that modern Christians also use. That's why certain Christian apologists will talk about the Islamic God Allah not being the same God. They'll use the same arguments that the atheists use, but it's rather a silly argument. For one thing, it's almost always Islam that they bring up, and they talk about the Islamic God Allah as if Allah is the name of the Muslim God, when in reality Allah just means the God in Arabic, and Muslims don't worship the God Allah, they worship Allah, which is the God. But besides that, in everything else in life, we accept the possibility that two people can look at the same object and have different beliefs about it, and that one can be mistaken about certain things about it. Both could be mistaken. But we don't apply that to God. To God, either the Christian view of God is accurate, or else it's a different God altogether. And that's a rather silly assumption to make. And it keeps us divided, and the question of which God, how do you know your religion's God is the true one and not the others, serves as a way of reinforcing materialism because, again, it smuggles in the idea that you somehow have to justify believing that your God in your religion is true and not some other God. It assumes that every religion worships a different God, and it assumes that they worship a different God because gods do not exist. And that's another way that modern language is shaping what is ultimately an irrational dialogue. Because to me, God is like the moon. Before man landed on the moon, people used to have all sorts of beliefs about it. For instance, the dark patches on the moon were believed once to be seas, lakes. That's why they're called Marianas. That's the oceans on the moon. Some people believe that there might be men living on the moon. Some people believe that perhaps the moon has silver glowing plants. And even when we realize that that more than likely isn't true, if you look at artistic renditions of what the moon looks like before we ever sent any probes there, before we knew for certain, you will often see depictions of the moon, even by artists hired by scientific institutions to try and be as accurate as possible, that depict a lunar surface of jagged rocks and large stalactite-like features jutting from the Earth, which we know aren't really there, that that's not how the surface of the moon really looks, but they believed it to be so. And it was also argued for a long time how much dust actually accumulated on the lunar surface. Some people thinking it would be waist deep, so that when man landed there, he would sink down to his waist. Others thought perhaps he would be even deeper and would even be submerged in it like water. Turned out that it's less than an eighth of an inch, but we didn't know that. And therein lies the point. Before man actually went to the moon, there were many ideas about what the moon was like. Some of them proved to be accurate, some of them proved to be inaccurate, and some of them are in between, where they're partially accurate but not quite. But no one looks at those historical descriptions of the moon and claims that people are talking about different moons in orbit around the Earth. One with a jagged rocky surface, another one with a more sandy surface, one that has people dressed like Quakers on it, and another one being a lifeless barren waste. No one looks at these descriptions and thinks they're different moons. We all understand that these are descriptions of the same moon we see in the night sky. We just know that some of the descriptions prove to be inaccurate. And we do this with other things. Other planets in the solar system have had similar treatment. The surface of Mars, the surface of Venus, the surface of Mercury, what Pluto looked like. And yet no one thinks that these older descriptions, before we knew better, were talking about different objects altogether. And you see different historical theories about various historical people being argued by different historians, all without us saying that they're talking about different people because they disagree on the type of person they are, or the type of events that happened. We don't say that there are two Peloponnesian Wars just because two historians have a different understanding of how they actually played out. And a good example of that would be the war between Troy and the Greeks, which we once relegated to mythology and not real history, and that we've later discovered was probably a real war. Well, I've read up about this, and ever since they've discovered the real city of Troy, and that there probably was a real war and a real fall of Troy, we now have theories about the real causes of it. Causes that, of course, preclude the Iliad from being accurate because it is a mythological work, which is the mistake we made earlier when we talked about it not having happened at all, but we like committing that mistake in the name of being rational adults who have evolved past primitive beliefs. But now we have people arguing that the Trojan War wasn't really over Helen. Perhaps Helen was a symbol representing a desire for Greek power in oceanic trade, or perhaps the goal of the war was because Troy had cornered the market on horses, or something along those lines. And I've actually read both of those theories, that it was mostly a trade war of some sort, or that it was mostly a war of conquest, the Greeks trying to project their power out. But no one talks about these as several different Trojan wars, with one historian's view being a different Trojan war than another historian's view. We all talk about the Trojan War as a single war, and we're just trying to figure out the real causes of it. But for some bizarre reason, when it comes to God, we can ask which God, and it be a rational question. And we can talk about the Christian God Yahweh versus the Muslim God Allah. And to me, that's always been a rather silly perspective. Muslims are even an Abrahamic faith. And even though many Christians don't like admitting this, Muslims do worship the same God. Obviously, from a Christian point of view, they're mistaken about certain attributes of God. But so are Jews, and often in the same way. For instance, I will often hear Christians themselves say that the Muslim God Allah, and they always treat Allah as a name. It's not. I mentioned that earlier, but they always treat it as such. And they'll say, the Muslim God Allah can't be Yahweh. Here are differences, like Allah has no son. Allah is not a trinity. Allah would not come down and take on human form and things like that. And they don't seem to realize that the same will apply to Jews. Jews, they will readily admit, worship the same God that Christians do. But we know Muslims have a different God, that Allah is not the God Christians worship, because Allah is not a trinity. Well, there are certain Christian groups that don't believe in the Trinity. And we don't say they worship a different God. Jews do not accept that God is a Trinity either. We don't say it's a different God with the Jews. Allah has no son. Well, Jews don't believe that God has a son either. Muslims think Jesus was a prophet. They do not think he was God incarnate. Some go so far as to say Muslims don't believe he was the Messiah. This isn't true. They do believe he was the Messiah. But it is true to say that they view Jesus as a prophet. That Jesus is not understood by them to be God incarnate. That's true. But Jews don't even regard Jesus as a prophet. Indeed, many Jews think that Jesus is boiling in hell in a pile of excrement. The Muslim view is actually more respectful than the Orthodox Jewish version. And yet Jews worship the same God and Muslims don't. It's all a rather silly word game that doesn't take into account nuance or the possibility that two people can believe in the same thing but have different understandings of it. And I'm not being a relativist. I myself am a Christian, and I actually think Muslims are simply wrong about certain things. But I don't think Muslims are wrong about everything, and I don't think Muslims worship a different God. But that's the problem with modernity. It's all about trying to define things with words as if the word descriptions aren't simply descriptions of a physical reality, but define the physical reality. And Christians themselves have gotten in on that game, and it's rather absurd when you think about it. And I honestly think that God has been revealed to every culture. The Bible itself says this. I don't think the gods of non-Abrahamic religions, the creator gods, are different creator gods. I don't think that Brahman is necessarily different than the god the Christians worship. I do believe that Hindus are mistaken about certain things, but I do think that the ultimate creator of reality is the same God. I think that when Tao speaks of God as a creator, it's talking about the same God, that God has revealed himself, and these are just cultural understandings of God that built up around that revelation. I don't think that each religion has a different God. And why should I? We already know that materialism is false, and we already know that consciousness is embedded in the nature of reality. We don't want to admit it as a culture because it would shatter our materialist views, but we know it's true. We just don't like the truth. And we don't want people saying, as devoted materialists, that our thoughts and prayers are with you. Because we don't want to think about the scary truth that we don't live in a materialist world that we can just control through scientific central planning. And we don't want people appealing to God. We want man to be the center of creation. We want man to be in control. And while we can think of something superior to God, we can think of an AI that comes along that can think much more brilliantly and more intelligently than man, and that can basically become a god. We can build a god to control our lives. That God is ultimately something that emerges from matter and was created by the hand of man. It is about elevating man as the creator. And that is why saying our thoughts and prayers are with you is so offensive to them. Because it is an affront to the centrality of humanity and to humans being above all else. That even if we build that AI that's smarter than humans, it came from humanity and can be seen as an extension of humanity and human power. And that is why saying our thoughts and prayers are with you is so offensive. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.